So, the president says that any football player who kneels for the national anthem should be fired. And the NFL tells the president to go fuck himself.
Hey, poor! Hey, poor! Hey, poor! You don't have to be poor anymore! Jesus is here!
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
Man, you are one twisted fuck. Nope. I'm just an ordinary guy with nothing to lose.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, not far from the redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is curled up on the couch, and I have no idea where Buttons is. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cats. Get over it. This episode features my interview with Luciano, co-host of the Benito Juarez Experience podcast and the author of the Sin God blog on Pathos.com. This is the conversation that he and I had in the wake of the Confederate statue being pulled down in Durham, North Carolina. My apologies to Luciano for not getting this out sooner, but in the wake of Trump complaining about people non-violently expressing their First Amendment rights, followed by a number of NFL teams doing just that, I think that much of our conversation is still timely. I'm just going to quickly drop into the conversation as I have to be getting to bed, since I have to get up early in the morning to go to work, because I've got to be there at 6 o'clock in the morning, so I have to get up at 3 o'clock in the goddamned morning to make it there on time. If I can, I will squeeze out a bonus episode later on in the week dealing with other issues you may not have heard about. I will mention that I'm going to be on the Packard Pokes At podcast in a couple of weeks talking about all kinds of different things. But right now, here's my conversation with Luciano. My guest this evening is Luciano. He writes the Sin God blog at Pathos.com, and he hosts the Benito Juarez Experience podcast. Thanks for being on the show, Luciano.
I'm really excited to be here today, Tucker.
Okay, so you're a historian, and you know a little bit about, apparently, the history behind all the monuments to the Confederate soldiers, which have been erected in the South primarily. I don't think there's any in the North. I could be wrong about that. So, since they're all the rage to talk about these days, let's get into, when they started being erected and why.
So a lot of these statues do exist in the North, but in considerably smaller numbers, for reasons that I would hope would be obvious to most of our listeners. The idea that building these statues and monuments in the North, while it's popular with some people who live in the North, or it was popular with some people who lived in the North, it wasn't as neat as it was in the South, and the fervor to defend these statues also wasn't as tense as it was in the North, or as it was in the South. Lots of historians have noted that the reason and the time that these statues started appearing tends to vary from region to region, but a lot of them, in fact the vast majority of them, appeared between the 1890s and the 1950s, which most people correctly realize is the era of Jim Crow segregation.
Right, and now I've been told this, and I don't know if it's correct, but guys like Robert E. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest, who started the Klan, objected to monuments to the Confederacy.
That's more or less correct. The reasons that they objected differed from person to person, but with Robert E. Lee, he didn't really like the idea of his image or the image of other key Confederacy leaders being used to perpetuate what he called the sores of the era, of the age. And what that meant, for those who might be a little bit confused about it, is that he wasn't exactly a fan of his face and the face of some of his former allies being used to exacerbate the memories of the oppression of African Americans, of the oppression of the people who lived in the South during the time of the Confederacy.
Right, and Lee was opposed to secession, as I recall. He never was a fan of it, even though he did join the Confederacy and lead one of their armies.
He was against it to a certain extent. The idea that he wholesalely opposed it isn't exactly based in fact. It's probably a combination of the fact that he personally was against secession. He thought it was a bad idea for Virginia to succeed, and history has more or less proved him correct in that. It was a disaster for Virginia, it was a disaster for all the states in the South for them to succeed, and it ended up costing them dearly, which was one of the reasons that he feared succeeding from the Union in the first place.
Yeah, I know that William Tecumseh Sherman was the head of what I think became Tulane University in Louisiana. Whatever school it was that he was running then had a different name than it does now, and it's one of the big schools in Louisiana. And when, the South seceded and Sherman quit immediately, and when somebody said, "Oh, this is going to be glorious," blah, 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 Sherman said, "You people are stupid. You have nothing. To defend yourselves with. You are completely unprepared for what's going to happen." And he turned out to be right. So, and from what you're saying, Lee also had the same idea, but Lee was a little more in love with Virginia than he might ought to have been, because I know he claimed that if Virginia hadn't gone, he would have stayed in the and fought for the Union, but because Virginia went, he had to go.
So one of the things that people have noted, a really good article on Lee appears in the Smithsonian, is that he, by all accounts, most notably his own, was deeply in love with the area that he called home. And there's actually, North Carolina also had a similar debate to Virginia when it came to the question of whether or not to secede from the Union. North Carolina, by at least some North Carolina historians, is believed to be the state that suffered the most from the Civil War, the state that lost the most soldiers, and the state that had the most to lose. And I feel that that's kind of an unfair assessment, because I'm sure most states probably consider themselves to be the states that lost the most from the war on both sides. It's not just the idea that the Confederacy was the only state that lost things, but I'm sure there are victims on both sides, many sides, who feel very strongly about this topic. I think it's important that people know that Lee didn't agree with the Confederacy. The idea that this absolves him of any blame is, of course, ridiculous, but we shouldn't be rushing to make these snap judgments of him or thinking that he was this atrocious human being when he himself probably wasn't, even if he was objectively on the wrong side of history.
Yeah. Well, I know that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was the vast majority of books about the Civil War all came from the South. Northern authors largely ignored the topic. And there was somebody who wrote, he I think it was the first biography of Grant, the first really negative biography of Grant, and he would, like, every day on his way to work, he passed the statue of General Lee and he would salute that. And at least from what I'm able to gather, these people, for all their talk about, Lee, after the war, did these, became a humanitarian and did all these other things, they don't discuss that. They glorify the military career of Lee in the Civil War rather than praising his actions as somebody who tried to reform and restore the country after the war.
That's more or less accurate from my understanding of this particular era in history.
Yeah, so the statues were put up. Do we know, or do you know, which was the first statue honoring the Confederacy or a leader in the Confederacy to go up after the war?
I don't believe that I know the exact one, although I do know some details about the one in Charlottesville, the one that everyone was talking about that caused everything to happen over the last couple of days.
Okay, well, let's get into that then.
So the reason the statue actually once had a name, I'm trying to see if I can find the exact name, but it was also placed in Lee Park, and it was a statue depicting, it is a statue, it still exists. It's a statue depicting Robert E. Lee and his famous horse Traveler. The statue was commissioned in 1917 by Paul Goodloe McIntyre. I don't have that many details on McIntyre, aside from the fact that he himself was an investment banker and is generally considered a philanthropist. But the conversations revolving around the statue first began to get really intense in 2016, where at which point in time, various groups in Charlottesville would actually begin talking about how to best deal with the statue, whether or not the statue actually belonged to be in public, and whether or not the park itself, which was at the time named Lee Park, should be named Lee Park. At this point in time, they voted to remove the statue. They voted to actually move it elsewhere. They also voted to rename the park, which gave it its current name, Emancipation Park. But various groups, various other factions, including apparently a few white nationalist groups. I remember reading that there were white nationalists who were taking credit for challenging the decision of the city of Charlottesville to get rid of the statue. They challenged it, and apparently they feel like they succeeded. I'm not sure if the court case is actually still ongoing, but they definitely succeeded in keeping the statue in its current location, which was part of the events that happened earlier this week. Not earlier this week, a week ago. Yeah.
So, as you pointed out, the statues became popular during the Jim Crow era. Sort of like how a lot of states suddenly felt compelled to add the Confederate flag to their state flag during the Civil Rights era. Do you know any of the, any specifics that triggered certain statues or, triggered statues in general? For example, while I know what the Jim Crow era was, I don't really know what brought it about.
So the Jim Crow era, the Jim Crow laws actually began as a concept during the Reconstruction period, which was the period directly following the Civil War, most especially in the South. Some of the things that happened to bring them into power was in the 1870s, the Democrats began gaining seats in the southern states. And they did this in a variety of both legal and illegal ways. One of the things that they would do was they used insurgent paramilitary groups to disrupt the ability of Republicans who, as everyone now knows, have sort of switched positions when it comes to things like African American voting and when it comes to race relations, at the very least legislatively, most especially in the South. Because as far as I can tell, in the North and in other parts of this country, this isn't quite as big a deal as it is in the South. Both of us live in southern states. I live in North Carolina. You live in Tennessee. I'm sure that both of us have seen, at the very least to some extent, and we've heard people in our circles talking about modern day events with Republicans and African Americans and Hispanics and non-white voters. But in the 1800s, this was reversed. The Republicans were the party who wanted not necessarily to give every single right to African Americans, but they definitely were the party that was against slavery versus the Democrats, who didn't quite support slavery itself, but weren't ready to oppose the institution of slavery. They didn't have the power or the political will to go ahead and dismantle it as aggressively as they should have. But in the period directly following the Civil War, these laws would start to gain popularity in the South. And African Americans were still able to get into political office. They were still able to run. They were still able to vote. But there were Jim Crow laws that placed limitations on their abilities. Some Jim Crow laws attempted to make it so that you had to own land in order to be able to vote. Other ones required you to pay poll taxes or take literacy and comprehension tests, which is obviously illegal now, but wasn't the case before.
Well, I think the poll tax was illegal, but the laws against it weren't enforced.
Yeah.
Not that this should be surprising. To go to it was the University of Virginia in Charlottesville where all that stuff went down. Do you know if I mean, I realize that to you this is going to be like a well, duh kind of question, but I'm sure not everybody else is familiar with it, not living in this region of the world. But are there still buildings on that campus that are named in honor of Confederate soldiers or, Confederate figures?
So one of the issues with that in Virginia is that these buildings, obviously there's the conversation about the fact that it was a Confederate state. And by the time it was a Confederate state, the University of Virginia had already been founded. It had already been existing for almost half a century at that point.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson founded it.
Yeah. The one in Charlottesville, I'm not sure of the exact details of, but I can tell you that in other states, this is still an ongoing conversation. To give you an example of this, I attended the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and we had a auditorium named after a Mr. Aycock. Mr. Aycock was an educational advocate who is much beloved in North Carolina, but he had difficulties with race. He was a supporter of education for women, but he wasn't someone who was very progressive on the topic of race. So as late as 2015, we actually had the auditorium named after him. It was in 2015 and 2016 when conversations about the topic would get so heated that it was decided that they should just rename the auditorium. And if that's the case with how it is in North Carolina, I'm sure we can pretty safely bet that there are buildings, maybe not necessarily in Charlottesville, and I'm sure after the events of August, I'm sure even now they're having conversations where they should be like, oh, maybe we should rename these. Yeah, just be consistent.
Well, the college I went to here in Tennessee, in the Student Union building, they had a plaque honoring Nathan Bedford Forrest, which was rather surprising. And then one of the dorms was named Forrest Hall, after Nathan Bedford Forrest. There, also on that campus, strangely enough, was a building built in the 1950s that, when you looked at the columns over the entryway, you realized they had swastikas on them. Don't quite get how that happened.
That's a heck of an oversight.
Yeah, I mean they're stylized, but they're definitely swastikas, and whoever designed that, would have been familiar with the people who made that symbol famous. And recently at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, there's been a huge fight over a dorm. I think it's a dorm. It's some building on campus that was paid for by the Daughters of the Confederacy. And the deal when they paid for the building back in maybe the 50s, I think, maybe longer than that, was that, it always would have that name and all this on it. And the universities kind of realized, it's probably not good that we have something like that since we're supposed to be a really liberal college. And I don't know how it got worked out with that, whether or not they managed to get the name off or if all the lawsuits involved in it have been settled. I know there was some kind of resolution to it, but I don't remember what it was.
So the Daughters of the Confederacy are actually a really, really important group in the conversation that we're having and the conversation that other podcasts are having and other historians are having, because there are very few groups that have the combined resources, not necessarily that the Daughters of the Confederacy have now, but that they did during these eras. And a professor from my university, from the university that I graduated in, wrote an article where he talked about the role of the Daughters of the Confederacy. They built and they ordered numerous statues. One of the biggest ones that they ordered has been called the Mount Rushmore of the Confederacy, and it's a stone carving of Davis, Lee, and Jackson, and it's in Stone Mountain, Georgia.
Right. And I know at one point in time they used to have big laser light shows and all kinds of festivals there. Not just, a Civil War reenactment, but they would, it was an event kind of place, and they would do things there. It's sort of like an outdoor dinner theater type situation. At least that's my understanding. I've never been there. I have heard of it, though.
I actually graduated from high school in Georgia. To North Carolina to go to college. I'm pretty sure I was a good distance away from Stone Mountain, though.
Yeah, you probably know it. There's a lot of stuff there unrelated to that. It's a bit of a tourist draw. There was, I don't know if it's still there or not, but there was a classic car museum that had a lot of very rare automobiles in that area. Rare in general, and they all just happened to be there. I don't know, it had closed or something. I'm only interested in a handful of cars, and they had one, and I know it was taken off display for some reason, and I don't remember what it was, but that's kind of the side point. Now, I know that the Southern Poverty Law Center has declared, rightfully so, the Sons of Confederate Veterans to be a hate group. They said the same thing about the Daughters of the Confederacy?
I wouldn't be surprised if they have, but I haven't read anything on that group specifically in the last couple of years. So, the thing about the Daughters of the Confederacy is that a few of their people left. I know, it wasn't a big thing, but I know of people, because me and you were raised in the South, I'm sure both of us, are at the very least aware that these groups are probably relatively nearby. But I know of people who have taken part in the meetings and who were raised in these groups and then left. And it's very weird for them to try and talk about it. I'm pretty sure that there's something going on with the Daughters of the Confederacy right now. Let me see if I can find it. I can't find it specifically, but I'm pretty sure that there was something about them in the news a couple of weeks back. I'll have to see if I can find it.
Yeah. Well, the three groups I know of who, try to appear respectable in regards to the Confederacy, although they're not really. I mean, even if there's no racism in the Daughters of the Confederacy, really not something they ought to be proud of. But there's this, the Sons of the Confederacy, which have been linked, are a hate group as far as Southern Poverty Law Center is concerned. And like I said, I don't disagree with that assessment, having known a few members in my time. And there's also a group I just recently found out about called League of the South.
Yeah, I've heard about them before. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. They seem to be the more extreme version of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Besides the Klan, are there any groups like that you know of that, pretend to be, we're just, we're just like the Daughters of the Revolution or the Mayflower Society, but really probably aren't?
So when I was writing my article I wrote an article for Pathos, which talked a little bit about the idea of whether or not Confederate statues should be up in public. I was researching museums, and it's not quite a hate group, but I know that there was a museum in New Orleans, which got a very strong backlash, especially in the wake of the recent events in New Orleans that took place earlier this year, which did have a minor role in motivating the people who created the Unite the Right rally, which took place in Charlottesville. The events in New Orleans where they took down 4 statues, they took down 4 monuments to Confederate leaders and to white supremacist locals, it caused a very strong backlash from this museum. I don't believe that anyone from this museum went to the rally, as far as I'm aware, but I do know that they talked very negatively about the movement to remove the statues, which took place in March in New Orleans, if I'm remembering it correctly.
Yeah. And it was done under the cover of darkness and totally stunned a lot of people, and the mayor gets mad props because he just went out and said, this is not who we are, this is not who we should be, and they're going down. So, since you're near Durham, let's talk about the pulling down of the statue. When was that statue originally erected?
So, I haven't been able to do a whole lot of research into that. I actually wanted to go to Durham in the next couple of days and talk about them, but the statue was of a Confederate soldier, and in the total reaction, everything that's gone on, it seems like the order of events was, in the wake of Charlottesville, a group of individuals organized themselves and went to the statue, pulled it down, and currently, as of yesterday, it was 8 individuals who've been arrested, but I believe as of today, it's been 9. I'm pretty sure today it was 9, but over 200 people went to turn themselves in for pulling down the statue / being at the protest in support of the protest where the statue was pulled down. And I think that's very interesting because I haven't seen, as far as I'm aware, there's been no other moment like this in all of the other southern states where an event like this took place and then the reaction was so immediate because the statue was pulled down on, I believe it was on Monday.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. Yes, it was on Monday. Reading a source right now. And what happened afterward was there was no immediate reaction aside from the fact that the news was there. I don't know if they actually got to see people pull down the statue, but I do know that the statue being pulled down and destroyed was live streamed. So there were people who were physically there recording the event when it took place. And now it seems that Durham is being flooded, not necessarily with activists, but with people who are supporting the people who went and took down the statue, which is very fascinating to me. I'm sure other historians whose specialty is the South will appear and we'll talk about this more in detail in the future.
Yeah, well, it's also surprising because a bunch of other states have come out and either said we're taking ours down, or or they took theirs down, or they're saying we need to take these down, because Maryland's pulled down a bunch. Alabama, in Birmingham, they covered up one of theirs. They aren't sure if they can remove it or not legally, but they're trying. The Tennessee state legislature is going to be discussing whether or not they should have that bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest up in there, which is surprising.
So I actually wanted to ask you, what do you think should be done about the statues?
They ought to be pulled down. I think not pulled down. I mean, removed. Let's not let mob violence rule the day, but they do need to come down because they are a symbol of, a very wretched point in our history, and we don't need to be honoring that. I mean, I wouldn't have an objection to a monument, say, to the soldiers who died in all the wars that happened to include ones who fought in the Confederacy, but a monument dedicated strictly to Confederate or, Confederate soldiers or Confederate government officials, that ought to go.
So my opinion on this is relatively similar. One of the things that I think, I don't have an issue with the statues themselves as much as a lot of other people probably think that I should. One of the biggest dangers, I think, of the statues being out in public is not that they're easily destroyed, although they are, that if you want to defend the statues, you should probably support them being put into museums and removed from the public eye. But one of the bigger issues is that these statues being out in public, oftentimes without a whole lot of context about them, makes them a tool for white supremacists and neo-Nazis. And the reason that I say this, and the reason at least a few other historians are also talking about this with the same perspective that I am doing, is that these statues being out in public allows them to be easily interpreted. It allows them to be tools for white supremacists who want to say that if anyone threatens these statues, they're trying to erase history. And it's one of the biggest issues about this is the fact that lots of people mean well when they say things like, oh, if you take down these statues, you are erasing history. That's not what's going on, but we can't dismiss everyone who is against removing these statues as white supremacists or racists. It's just that these statues being out there make them easy tools for white supremacists who want to use them to spin whatever narrative it is that they're trying to spin, whether it's about them being persecuted or about the history of what they call white America being erased.
Right. And as long as they're out on public display like they are, they can say, well, you see, people in the government still support us and still support our ideas because if they didn't support what the Confederacy was, and in their noble tradition, as they would describe it, the statues are up, so that means they have support for it. So sooner or later, we'll be able to bring back that time, or some element of that time. And
one of my main concerns with these statues, the conversations that we're having about them, is that we are not having the right conversations about them. One of the things that I want to talk about, and one of the reasons why I'm going on to different podcasts and talking about this topic at length, is that people are conflating these statues with education. People are assuming that these statues have the right historical context attached to them, have historical plaques that educate people about them. That's not always the case. And more than that, people are pretending that by erasing these statues or removing them and putting them somewhere else, we are removing opportunities for people to learn about history, as if historians don't exist, as if history teachers don't exist, as if communication majors who like the Civil War don't already exist and don't already talk about these topics more at length than a statue celebrating the life of Robert E. Lee, which I sort of understand because he is a complex historical figure who shouldn't be boiled down to any single thing in his life. But the idea that we should make statues to a general who attempted to protect slavery, who attempted to defend the right of a fake nation to wage a war with the United States, is a little bit weird to me. Partially because my parents are veterans, but also because the way that I learned history clearly shows that this probably isn't a person that we should be on record as defending, even if he is more complex than lots of people want him to be.
Right. Well, and like I said, after the war, he supposedly, tried to heal the nation and things like that. Well, if you wanted to emphasize that view of him, then when you put him, a statue of him wearing a suit and like stepping on the Confederate flag, or holding something dedicated to whatever university it was that he was the president of, but they don't. They're all of him in his military dress uniform, oftentimes on a horse, waving a sword. So it's clear they're wanting the militant view of him perpetuated, not the complex figure, or not the the reformer.
It's very important that people change how we have conversations about this. And that's one of the reasons why it's awesome that there are podcasts out there that are talking about this. It's unfortunate that one of the things that makes it a necessary conversation for lots of podcasts to have are the events in Charlottesville, because frankly, it shouldn't have taken this long for people, but not just in the South like me and you are, but people all over the nation, to have real conversations about the complexities of Confederate memorials, about what it means for people's histories, and what it means for the figures that we're actually talking about, whether it's Robert E. Lee or Nathan or Ulysses S. Grant or Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah. And there is a statue to a Confederate soldier a couple of blocks away from where I live. I walked past that and drove past it, I don't know how many times before I ever figured out what it was. Because there's not really anything that you can identify with him as being a Confederate on the statue. It's obviously a soldier, but his garb and weapon are so indistinct from the road that it could be, honoring somebody who fought in the Revolutionary War, or, the War of 1812, or the Mexican-American War. And it was only one day when I was walking by, and I looked at it, and I just walked up to it, and I'm like, oh, wow, we have a Confederate statue here. Which, this part of Tennessee was occupied really early on in the Civil War. We didn't... I think we didn't make it to 1862 in this area without the Union force showing up and taking things over. There's a, not too terribly far away from it, like a block away from that Confederate statue, are two state historical markers dealing with slaves joining the Union Army. And I guess the first ones in the state joined the Union Army here. This town actually does not really have a lot of history tied to the Civil War, unlike Murfreesboro, where I went to college here. The Battle of Murfreesboro was a pretty big deal, apparently.
So you mentioned something about the other wars in relation to one of the statues that you saw. And I think that I'm sure that people who are going to be listening to this podcast, especially if they've never listened to your podcast before and are only listening to this one for the historical conversation, are probably going to be wondering about a very particular and very specific piece of legislation that impacts not necessarily all soldiers, but veterans and soldiers who fought in the United States throughout the 19th century. I don't know if you are aware of this, but there was a 1958 legislation where it seems to those who are unfamiliar with a particular piece of legislation, it could be easily construed as making Confederate soldiers veterans in the same way that Union soldiers were veterans. And it's very tricky because I've seen conservatives in my social circles sharing this meme that talks about this particular piece of legislation. And prior to today's show, I decided to research it because I figured it'd be worth talking about for anyone interested in the idea that veterans viewed Confederate soldiers as other veterans. That's not true. The law that was passed, or the law that was created, was attempting to make Confederate soldiers eligible for some of the same benefits as Union soldiers. This is because many people who fought in the Confederacy went on to fight in the Army of the United States later on, whether it was the Spanish-American War or any of the other conflicts that we were engaged in, maybe even theoretically World War I, although any soldier who fought in the Civil War and fought in World War I would have spent their entire lives as a soldier. Very long time to be in the service. And this is a very strange claim because the main purpose of this particular 1958 piece of legislation was to give their widows and their wives and their families access to pensions from the VA, rather than to somehow exonerate them from any wrongdoing or clear their names in any particular way.
Right, and it's a good bribe, as it were, so you keep the resentment levels down. So you don't have the next generation saying, well, if we had won the Civil War, my father fought in it, we'd have all these benefits and we don't get anything, so I'm, gonna be an agitator. Whereas if they're getting a pension or they were taken care of as a kid because their mother got, a stipend or pension from the government, then it pacifies them to an extent.
Yeah, it helps remove some of the fresh stings of war, especially for younger people, not necessarily for the people who once served themselves, but for their children in the post-Civil War South. And I know I took numerous history courses on the Civil War, and I did lots of reading on the Civil War myself, having lived in the South most of my life that I wasn't raised in Latin America. So I thought that it would be worth looking into. And it's important that people realize that there were still lots of tensions in the South. It sounds obvious to those of us who live in the South, and to those of us who live in the South, I'm sure at least some of us have seen people who haven't really forgotten or moved beyond in any real capacity the causes of the Civil War. And I don't mean people of color. Living in North Carolina, lots of the people that I see who haven't moved beyond the Civil War are not people of color.
Yeah. Yeah. The everybody I know who talks about the Civil War, they're all white. And it's there's I can't think of the guy's name because he's got one of these long New England names. It's like Thomas Whitworth Higginston or something like that. But he wrote a book called Army Life in a Black Regiment. And he led the first unit of escaped slaves during the Civil War. And in the book, he rages about how he could never get one of his soldiers promoted to an officer because that soldier was black. And he's like, he's the best soldier I've ever seen. He needs to be an officer. And yet you don't hear a discussion about that from anybody. There was a brief flurry of discussion when the movie Glory and the movie Buffalo Soldiers came out. But since then, you don't hear anything. And there's it certainly needs to be a discussion that we have on it, because it is, it is an integral part in the war, and having the slavery was really the main cause of the Civil War. I know the deniers will say, no, it was about states' rights, but that state right that they were all fighting for was the right to own other people as property. And it was even written into the Confederates' Constitution that the federal government could never get rid of slavery.
So there is actually an article by Civil War Trust which examines 4 states. It examines Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and South Carolina, who wrote I believe what it was called was the Declaration of Causes. And it was, in all 4 of them, aside from in South Carolina, slavery was the clear majority of the reason for the succession. And it is very important that people realize that slavery, if you're not going to say slavery was the real reason for the Civil War, it's important that we still understand that even within the context of states' rights, slavery was the reason for the Civil War.
Yeah.
It's so much the case that Prager University, who are very often wrong about the things that they share online, had a historian who went in and decimated this idea. He was a military historian. I can't remember his exact name off the top of my head, but he decimated the idea with clear evidence, even from a conservative point of view, that slavery was the reason for the Civil War. And there's lots of evidence for this. I've written about this. I've talked about it. I have articles. I'm pretty sure I have an article or 2 where I talk about this in pretty substantial detail. I'll see if I can find them, because they were on one of my older websites where I talked about Southern history. And it's very clear to people who not only live in the South, but also to people who listen to the way people talk about these issues, that slavery and the right to own a slave was the reason for this war.
Yeah, and I don't know if you're familiar with Alexander Stevens' Cornerstone speech. Stevens was the vice president of the Confederacy, and in his Cornerstone speech, he lays out in plain English that the Confederacy is there because the natural order of things is for the white man to rule over the black man.
I'm aware of him. I haven't read the Cornerstone speech, but this idea of a white male lording over everyone is not necessarily a staple of American history, but it's definitely a common recurring theme. And I'm trying to find the right way to phrase that without being too nice about it and without being overly harsh. But it's a very common theme, both in the North and in the South. But the idea that this isn't the thing that people believe, at the very least the leaders of the Confederacy, is a bit ridiculous. Obviously, not every single member of the Confederacy, not every single leader thought the same way. But it's still very important that people know that there are members of the Confederacy who genuinely believe these things. When they said it, they weren't saying it to rile people up. They weren't saying it to trump people up. They were saying it because they thought it was the way the world works.
Yeah. And even if, you have somebody who was, say, a leader in the Confederacy who is only there because they think it's wrong for for the government to send the military out against another portion of the population, the reason the government is doing that is all tied to slavery. I mean, if it hadn't been, for slavery, we wouldn't have had the Civil War. and this may not be something that you know about. I just recently found out about it on. Oh, I don't remember. It was an episode not too long ago of the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast, and I forget who Bruce Carlson was interviewing. It was some well-known historian, and he was saying that if Zachary Taylor hadn't died when he did, we would have had the Civil War a lot earlier, because the South was upset about tariffs or something. I forget what it was, and they were threatening to secede, and Zachary Taylor was like, okay, we're going to come down there, and then, of course, he had to go and die, and that defused the whole situation.
I believe it was the interview with, I'm looking at the episode right now. I know what episode you're talking about. I think it was the interview with Sidney something.
Sidney Blumenthal.
Yeah, that's what it was. I was trying to find it because I have a separate section pulled up on my computer where I'm looking at like my resources. But yeah, it was that interview, and I remember hearing it. I haven't listened to it in a little bit, so I'd need to listen to it again before I can remember exactly what was said.
Now, given that you're familiar with Bruce's podcast and his methodology, thing that I'm wondering now is, have we hit a point where it looks like we may actually have a real breakthrough in dealing with this stuff? Because, Trump brutally mishandled the whole situation, and that has left a bad taste in everybody's mouth. And it seems to me that like we're moving in a positive direction, and that while we may not get to the ideal place anytime soon, we're at least moving more than we have in a long time. And it's unlikely that we're going to end up in a really horrific situation that I thought we were certain to hit when he got elected. So I'm wondering if you feel the same way, or if you have a slightly different perspective on it.
I think that in general, probably in the last 25 years, we've been very slowly moving in the right direction. I think that there have been two key events that have happened. One of it's not nearly as far as I had suggested it was, but I think that the other main events that's going to move us forward in the right direction, aside from Charlottesville, is actually the Charleston church shooting. Yeah. And I dislike the way that this is going to sound until it's explained further, but I think that the reaction to the church shooting combined with what happened last week are going to force us to move in the right direction. Because in the aftermath of the Charleston church shooting, there were issues that happened in South Carolina. I believe it was the Confederate flag was actually lowered. And that was not the best response. It should have been done way sooner than that. But at the very least, it shows that there are events which can cause the appropriate reactions in this country. And I think that Charleston and Charlottesville are going to force us as a society to look at what we consider to be the heritage of the South, to look at our sort of deification of the Confederate leaders, especially of certain segments of society. And it's not just people, it's not just white people. I know plenty of Hispanics who talk about Mexican Confederates. I have an acquaintance who I know more on social media than I know like in real life, but who I have met face to face, who was a fan of the Confederacy, and he's Mexican. He talks about Mexican Confederates. And it's good that we are talking about this more forcefully in the wake of Charleston and Charlottesville. It's unfortunate that it took these life-ending catastrophes for us to have these conversations. That is a disgrace. but I do believe that we are very slowly inching in the right direction.
Yeah. I know after the church shooting, there were people who were saying, why are they now worried about these Confederate symbols? Well, why are we talking about these now? Why didn't we do it? This is such a big deal. Why didn't we do it before? And somebody pointed out, well, the discussion about gun control is completely off the table. So we got to talk about something related to this, and that's the other thing,
There have been ongoing conversations, at the very least in small circles, for years about everything that we're talking about right now. Whether it's historians discussing the Confederate statues, or it's free thinkers and even progressive Christians who are having conversations about whether or not it's appropriate to memorialize and, to a certain extent, trivialize the Civil War. And in my opinion, I do think that these statues, especially out in the public, out in the open, trivialize and make light of the Civil War. A Civil War which ended a long time ago, but whose ramifications still haven't been fully felt by the society, because at the very least, the South has a hard time talking about race.
Yeah. And I mean, the other day at work, I was sitting there on break, and I was hearing people who were complaining about, well, they're pulling down the statues, they're going to take away our history. And, and I didn't say it, because I kind of have to keep peace at the job, but it's like, there's no statues of a certain German anywhere in his home country, but we all know his name.
There was a Twitter, there's this Twitter log by this history PhD, and she talks about, she makes light of everything, and she does it appropriately. She's not like doing it negatively, but what she talks about is she jokes about how, as a history PhD, all you really learn about is how to create statues, because that's the way people learn about history. And I remember one of her tweets, one of my favorite tweets, was like, the era known as prehistory is the era before humans knew how to make statues. Which is one of my favorite things that I've read in reaction to this. As someone, I actually went to college with the intention of becoming a history teacher. When I first started off in college, I was a conservative Christian. By the time I left college, I was a aggressive, progressive atheist. And it's interesting because I also stopped wanting to teach history, because I met and became friends with not only other history teachers, but also people who were studying to teach history. And they felt limited by everything that they could do. And they also felt limited because they lived in an era where if they taught the actual history of this country, they could very well get in trouble for it. And I think that these are all very important topics for people to talk about. And I'm very grateful that you lent me a space wherein I could talk about how I felt about all of this, and where I could talk about how this impacts everything that's going on. Because right now, history teachers are also having conversations about how to teach race. They're having conversations about how to appropriately teach Southern history and the Civil War. They want to know how they can talk about these statues and what these statues mean.
I know that until fairly recently, there were huge issues with the family of Thomas Jefferson and the family of Sally Hemings. And now apparently I guess the old folks died off and the younger folks are like, yeah, okay, so great uncle, since I don't think his daughters all had surviving children, but those were all, anyways, great grandpa or whomever, yeah, we know he was banging the help, so we're gonna give you guys equal share of, things here. I know that they're restoring the room that Sally Hemings lived in at Monticello. And I know that I guess they're moving family members' remains, Hemming's family members' remains to Monticello as part of all that. So, and I mean, we don't have a good grasp of, the details in this country about race and how, race drove the founding of this nation. And it looks like that this incident, as horrific as it is at least having the positive effect of getting us to talk about some of the issues. Not all of them, but at least we're talking about some of them. And it seems, to me at least, I mean, I'm a white guy, so, I don't have the best perspective on this, but it seems to me that we're having a good discussion on it.
I am, as a Hispanic person, there's an ongoing conversation about what race Hispanics are, just by default. But I'm white Hispanic. My parents are Puerto Rican, but if you go back far enough, they're Italian. So I'm pretty white. So I'm kind of lucky in that regard. I'm definitely white passing, especially if you look at me face to face. But I'm seeing a new kind of conversation appear about race in social media circles. And I always find it sad that it always takes the most tragic situations for people to have, at the very least people in the South, to have the right sorts of conversations about these topics. But I appreciate that in this moment of tragedy, we can actually reflect on the events that have happened, and we can use it to give ourselves a new perspective. Even if it's only temporary, which the cynic in me fears it might be, at the very least, society itself isn't making the situation worse, even if our president hasn't been as nice as society has been.
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, my firm belief is that had he played his cards a little differently, this could have been his Reichstag fire moment. But because he's an idiot, it wasn't. Just because, really all he had to do was come out strongly against, because the guy that ran over everybody, he was a member, he was a member of a particular group. I mean, obviously, there were a whole bunch of white supremacist groups there. But if Trump had just focused on that group and ignored the others, he could have gotten some pretty strict things passed. But because he didn't want to alienate anybody on the white supremacist side, since that's a lot of his base, he, soft-pedaled everything and made himself look like an ass. I mean, all his advisory councils, except for the evangelicals, have all bailed on him. The evangelicals, of course, aren't going to bail on him because those guys all got their start due to racism. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I am not aware of the specific members of Donald Trump's group, but I am aware of the fact that numerous of his supporters have gone to places like Bob Jones University, which I'm sure if you just the name should probably give you like a bit of warning about Bob Jones University. But I believe that Donald Trump actually did go to a speech there. I'm not entirely sure, but I know one of his biggest supporters is one of the leaders of the university. I know that multiple evangelical leaders have gone there in the last couple of months. I wrote about when Ken Ham went there. Oh, God.
And Ken Ham has ties to the League of the South as well, by the way.
He does?
Yeah.
I'm not surprised, but that's actually new information. For me, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he, one of his dinosaur statues, a really expensive one, like a T-Rex statue, was gifted to him by the head of, or the former head of the League of the South, and Ken Ham has spoken at least one of their events, or not more. I can send you that link. I can find that, if you're interested.
Oh, man. I'm not like that. That doesn't surprise me in the slightest, but I wouldn't have assumed it. like, I wouldn't have come to the conclusion that was an event that definitively happened until someone told me. It's just not surprising that it happened.
Right. It's like, yeah, it's it's sort of like if somebody published photos of Trump and Ivanka having sex. It's like, yeah, not surprising. Not what I wanted to see, but it's not surprising. So let me ask you, what happened in college to flip you from being a conservative to being an atheist?
Not recently, but right before I graduated from college, I went on a podcast where I talked about this at length. But for me, the final trigger was actually the movie God's Not Dead. If you're talking about the thing that flipped the switch, it would have to be that movie, because I left that movie. I went into that movie as a Christian. I left it as an atheist. It was that immediate for me. But of course, there's a longer story where I talk about my life. My family are casual Catholics. I went to school in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I went to a conservative Christian school that turned me from a moderate Catholic into a young conservative Christian. And then over the course of the rest of my life, before I went to college, I went back to being a casual non-denominational Christian who believed that Christianity was the true religion, but wasn't super political or anything. And then by the time I watched that movie, I was already on the edge. It's just that God's Not Dead was the final trigger that it's yeah, I can't call myself a Christian anymore.
And something I meant to mention this earlier, and it slipped my mind because we got to talking about other stuff. Have you heard of the Confedereiros from Brazil?
Oh yeah, I have.
Okay.
It took me a second.
Yeah.
You're talking about the Confederate soldiers who left the Confederacy and went to Brazil, right?
Right. And they set up down there in Brazil, and then after about 10 years, Brazil gave up on slavery, and so I was reading an article last night on them. They were still fairly isolated up until the beginning of the 1920s or so, and then they just, they have become largely absorbed. I mean, they still have celebrations of the Confederacy, but, you see, people who are definitely not Caucasian dressed up in Confederate uniforms.
There was actually a North Carolina church that was accused. I'm going to look up the exact details of this, but they were accused of importing what amounted to slaves. And this was recent. This was this year.
Yeah.
There are incredible events, and I don't mean incredible good. I mean incredible, just they're unbelievable. There are events related to these sorts of conversations going on all over the place. But the conversation about a Confedereiros is actually a topic that I'm going to be talking about on my podcast in the near future. I've wanted to talk about it for a while now. It seems more relevant than it did before, because I'd actually been planning to talk about it when we started the podcast, rather than just now in the wake of Charlottesville. So I feel kind of odd having the conversation about it right now. I think I'm probably going to wait until October before we film that episode, but I'll definitely send the link to you when we talk about it.
All right. Well, why don't you just give everybody all the good details about your podcast, and we'll call this a wrap since we've been on this about an hour.
All right. Well, the Benito Juarez Experience is a podcast co-hosted by myself, Luciano Joshua Gonzalez, and Dr. Juem Navarro Rivera. He and I are both Puerto Ricans. He is an experienced political writer, talker, who has a very sense of education. He and I both have bios on our various websites. I'll include them. I'll send them to you so that you can include them in the link. But the purpose of the Benito Juarez Experience is to give secular Latinos something that they can listen to, where two other not necessarily super educated, as I only have my undergrad degree, but two educated, opinionated Latinos who are also atheists can get together and we can talk about trending topics. We want to talk about things in both English and Spanish. We actually have one episode fully in Spanish uploaded onto our website. It was the episode that was uploaded most recently. It was uploaded on the 16th of this month, which was 2 days ago from when we're recording this. And in it, we recap everything that we've done since April. We briefly talk about some of our favorite episodes, and we talk about some of the trending topics that we've covered in Spanish. But in English, we've talked about everything from the events in Russia with Donald Trump to events. We are going to be doing a Charlottesville episode. We have talked about the Paris Accord. We have talked about the liberal. We've talked about the conservatives. And we've talked about the religious right, the religious left, the secular left, and we've also talked about history of Pentecostal Latinos. We've just talked about a lot of really neat stuff that isn't normally considered to be podcastable material, partially because not a whole lot of super famous podcasts are done by Latinos who are capable of speaking Spanish fluently, like the two of us are, who are capable of reading and writing in Spanish like we are. And we're really looking forward to sharing our podcast with some of our friends and family. And we're looking forward to appearing on other podcasts like this one, where we talk about stuff that we're really interested in.
Well, glad to have you here.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fosnots.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.